Hi there. I'm just a little cat trying to reach my first 1,000 subscribers. It's free. Just click subscribe right under this video. It would mean the world to me.
My mom told me to get out of the house while we were halfway through dinner. I didn't say a word. I just kept eating the turkey I paid for. It was one of those moments you don't forget. Not because it was loud or explosive, but because it was so quiet you could hear the stuffing hit the plate when my brother dropped his fork. Thanksgiving had always been tense in our house, but that year it felt like the air itself had been holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. And sure enough, it did. Right when I was halfway through carving the turkey, the one I paid for, prepped, and cooked while everyone else argued over what kind of pie we'd be having. The table was full. Mom, Dad, Kyle, Aunt Cheryl, who always smells like menthols and hairspray, and Uncle Paul, who only shows up when there's food on the table and bourbon in the cabinet. I'd been up since 5 in the morning, basting and baking, juggling pots, trying to get everything perfect like I did every single year. No one offered to help. Not that they ever did. The comment came out of nowhere. We weren't talking about money or living arrangements or anything even remotely related. We were talking about cranberry sauce. That's the part that gets me. I was explaining how I made the sauce from scratch this time. No cans, just fresh cranberries, orange zest, and a splash of brandy. And out of the blue, Mom looked me dead in the eye, set her wine glass down, and said, "We're tired of supporting you. It's time you left." I thought I misheard her at first. I actually blinked and leaned forward a little, like maybe she'd said something about needing more salt. But no, she said it again, slower this time, with this strange smile on her face, like she was doing me a favor. "You've been here long enough, Jessica. We're just tired, honey. It's time for you to stand on your own." Nobody spoke. Not Dad, not Kyle, who was too busy stuffing mashed potatoes into his face. Even Aunt Cheryl kept her mouth shut for once. And me? I looked down at my plate, picked up my fork, and took another bite of turkey, perfectly brined, if I do say so myself. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even make a face. I just kept chewing, nodding slightly like she'd asked if I wanted more gravy. The thing is, what Mom said would have stung if it had made any sense. But the reality of it? I'd been supporting them. For the last 10 years, I'd been paying the mortgage, the utilities, the internet, the groceries. I'd bought Dad a new set of tires when his car started hydroplaning on wet pavement. I covered Kyle's health insurance when he turned 26 and had to come off my parents' plan. I'd paid for Mom's dental surgery when her molars started crumbling because she refused to stop chewing ice. I'd done all of it silently because it felt like the right thing to do, because we were family. But sitting there, chewing that turkey in front of people who looked at me like I was some kind of leech, something clicked. It wasn't hurt. It wasn't even anger, not yet. It was a kind of clarity, like a fog had lifted and I finally saw everything for what it was. They didn't respect me. They didn't appreciate me. And worst of all, they didn't even know what I'd done for them because I'd made it too easy. So I finished my dinner. I didn't speak a word the rest of the evening. I cleared my plate, said goodnight, and walked upstairs to the small converted attic room where I'd been sleeping for the last 5 years. Paying rent, mind you, on a house I technically owned. Because the deed, that was in my name too. They signed it over back when they were on the edge of foreclosure, and I came in with the cash to save it. It was supposed to be temporary, just a way to keep us from losing everything. But like everything else, temporary became permanent. I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, not angry, not sad, just calculating. I thought about every automatic payment I'd set up. I thought about the power bill, the gas, the insurance policies, even the monthly pest control service that kept the basement from turning into a cricket disco every fall. I realized that not a single thing in that house ran without me. And suddenly, the idea of leaving didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like liberation. Around 1 in the morning, I got up and made myself a cup of tea. I sat at the kitchen table, the same one we'd eaten at hours before, and opened my laptop. I logged into the bank. I opened the electric company's website. I stared at the auto pay on toggle and smiled as I clicked it off. One by one, I went through every account. I didn't close anything. I just paused the lifeline. If they were so tired of supporting me, they could find out what support actually looked like. Then, just for good measure, I changed the password to the Wi-Fi. I packed a duffel bag with the basics: laptop, chargers, a week's worth of clothes. The rest could stay. Let them think I was still upstairs. I left before dawn, locked the door behind me, and drove 20 minutes to a little Airbnb I'd booked before I even finished my tea. By the time they woke up, I was gone. By the time they realized what I'd taken, they'd realize what they'd lost. And I was just getting started. By the time the sun rose the next morning, casting that pale, unforgiving winter light through the windows of the modest Airbnb I'd rented, a little one-bedroom place above a detached garage behind someone's suburban home, I had already received 2 missed calls from Mom, 1 from Dad, and 3 text messages from Kyle that started passive-aggressive and gradually became unhinged. And the beauty of it all was that I didn't have to say a single word. I just let it play out, because for once, silence was going to be louder than anything I could say. What they didn't realize, what I never bothered to explain over the years, mostly because I never thought I'd need to, is that I had become the scaffolding holding up the crumbling structure of their lives. There was no grand confrontation where I laid out the bills, circled the mortgage statements, and highlighted my name on the utilities. There were no tearful arguments or last-chance family meetings. That's not how our family worked. We were the kind of people who pretended things were fine until they fell apart completely, and then blamed whoever was still standing. So when my phone buzzed again at 8:13 a.m., with a text that simply read, "Did you forget to pay the electric?" I leaned back in the unfamiliar bed, sipped the lukewarm coffee I'd made in the Airbnb's tiny kitchen, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Relief, not joy, not vengeance, not even smug satisfaction. Just a bone-deep kind of peace. The kind that comes from knowing the weight you've been carrying is finally off your back. The truth was, the financial entanglement between me and my family had become so convoluted over the years that even I had stopped fully tracking it. It started simple enough. Dad lost his job when the factory he'd worked at for 30 years downsized. He was 59 at the time and absolutely convinced he'd bounce back. Spoiler alert, he didn't. I'd been working remotely in finance for a startup that hadn't gone under yet, so I offered to cover the mortgage for a few months until he got back on his feet. That was 10 years ago. Then Kyle dropped out of college in his second year after deciding that traditional education wasn't for him, which was code for he failed every class that didn't involve a screen. He moved back in with our parents and immediately returned to the comfort of his Xbox and Reddit echo chambers, spending hours a day debating strangers about cryptocurrency, while contributing absolutely nothing to the household. When he turned 26, he had a full-blown panic attack because he was going to lose health insurance. So I added him to my policy without even thinking. That's who I was, still trying to be the glue, the fixer, the one who didn't rock the boat. As for Mom, well, she always had a way of making her needs seem like your responsibilities. She'd complain about her teeth hurting or her back locking up, then mention how expensive dental work is, or how long the wait lists are for decent physical therapy. And every time I'd step in, because she was my mom. Because I believed helping her was the right thing to do. Because I still hadn't learned that being needed isn't the same as being loved. I wasn't a saint, believe me. I had my moments of resentment, plenty of them. But I always swallowed it down and reminded myself that family sticks together, that someday things would balance out, that maybe one day Kyle would get a job, Dad would start contributing again, Mom would acknowledge what I'd done, but none of that happened. What happened instead was me being told, over the Thanksgiving meal I paid for, that I was a burden. So no, I didn't forget to pay the electric. I turned off autopay with a single click and let nature take its course. Same for the gas, water, internet, even their precious streaming subscriptions. The mortgage was on a month-to-month basis, which meant they had 30 days before anything legally changed. But the shock to their system hit almost immediately. At noon, I got another call. I let it go to voicemail. Her voice was shaking. Jess, I don't know what's going on, but the house is freezing and none of the lights work. Can you please check the account? She didn't even accuse me. Not yet. She was still in the part of the process where she thought it was all a misunderstanding. That phase wouldn't last long. I drove out to a quiet diner for lunch, sat in a booth by the window, and opened my laptop again. I started making a list. Everything they had that was tied to me. It was longer than I'd expected. The water heater, on my home warranty plan. The pest control service that kept termites out of the attic, that was billed quarterly to my card. Even the landscaping, the guy who came to rake leaves and trim hedges every month, was paid through my Venmo account. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became. They had built their lives on the silent assumption that I'd always be there to keep the lights on, in every sense of the word. And I don't think any of them even realized how much of their comfort was subsidized by my presence. That night, I slept better than I had in years. I didn't worry about Kyle slamming cabinets at 2 a.m. while making his third plate of leftovers. I didn't listen for the telltale sound of Dad's wheezing through the vents, or Mom pacing the kitchen because she couldn't sleep. The Airbnb had thick walls, clean sheets, and no expectations. By morning, I was no longer just toying with the idea of walking away. I was already gone. And the longer they sat in that cold, dark house, the more I hoped they'd finally realize what they'd done. But the thing about people like my family is, they never think they're the problem. They just start looking for someone to blame. I knew that call was coming, the one where blame starts replacing confusion, where the words turn sharp and the tone turns bitter. And when it did, I wasn't surprised. It was Kyle, and he was furious. The message was short but loud. "What the hell, Jess? The internet's down, the heat's off, and Mom's crying. What did you do?" His voice cracked on the last word, like the weight of adulthood was finally settling on his shoulders for the first time in his life. I didn't respond. Instead, I pulled up Zillow, and I clicked on List Your Home, because they thought they were supporting me. But reality? Reality was just about to knock the wind out of them. The voicemail came in just after 9 in the morning, and I'll admit, I played it twice. Not because I didn't catch what he said the first time, but because hearing the raw panic in Kyle's voice was the kind of validation I never thought I'd get in my lifetime. Certainly not from him. For over a decade, he had treated me like the background noise of his life. Like I was just part of the scenery, something reliable but invisible, something that did its job quietly and without complaint, like a power outlet or a toilet that always flushed. And now, in a matter of days, the illusion had cracked open, and he finally had to lift his head off the couch long enough to realize that the world didn't run on his terms alone. His message was as theatrical as it was immature. "Seriously, Jess? What the hell is wrong with you? You couldn't even give us a heads up before nuking the internet? I had a tournament today, a real one, and I lost my spot in the finals because you decided to be a psycho." There was some heavy breathing, a pause, and then the cherry on top. "Mom's crying, Dad's freaking out, and I'm telling you right now, if you don't fix this, I swear I'll—" That's where the voicemail cut off, either because he ran out of time or he realized, for the first time in his life, that he didn't have a single threat he could actually follow through on. I didn't call back. I didn't even bother saving the message. Instead, I closed my laptop, pulled on a hoodie, and went for a walk through the neighborhood where my Airbnb was nestled. Neat little ranch-style homes with tidy lawns and seasonal wreaths on every other door. The kind of place where people waved good morning even if they didn't know your name. It was quiet, peaceful, and the only screaming I heard came from a group of middle schoolers playing street hockey a few blocks down, not from inside the walls of a house suffocating under the weight of its own dysfunction. As I walked, I kept thinking about how easily things had spiraled at home, not just over the past few days, but slowly, quietly, over years, in the kind of way that sneaks up on you until one day you wake up and realize you're 40 years old and still living in a house where you pay every bill but have no say, where your contributions are treated as obligations and your boundaries are treated as betrayal. It wasn't just about the utilities or the internet or even the mortgage. It was about the years of small accumulating slights, Mom telling her friends I worked from home like it was some kind of adorable hobby instead of a six-figure career. Dad handing me grocery lists without ever asking if I had time. Kyle, who once laughed in my face when I asked him to unload the dishwasher, saying, "You love doing this stuff, don't you?" And the part that stung the most wasn't even the disrespect. It was that I let it happen. For so long, I convinced myself I was helping, that I was being the mature one, the dependable one, the person who held it all together. I thought if I kept giving, they'd eventually see it, appreciate it, maybe even reciprocate it. But the thing about being a silent martyr is that nobody knows you're bleeding unless you start to scream. Well, I wasn't screaming, but I wasn't silent anymore either. When I got back to the Airbnb, I made another cup of coffee, strong and black, the way Mom hates it, and sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop. I pulled up the email from the real estate agent I'd reached out to 2 days earlier. Her name was Natalie, mid-30s, bright and efficient, with a directness I immediately appreciated. She'd already pulled the records I needed and confirmed what I already knew. The deed was still in my name, and so was the mortgage. Legally, I didn't even need to give them notice. But I wasn't trying to be cruel. I just wanted my life back. I drafted a formal notice of intent to sell, attaching it to a polite but firm email addressed to all three of them, Mom, Dad, and Kyle, explaining that I would be listing the house within 30 days and that they should begin making alternative living arrangements. I didn't go into detail. I didn't point fingers or explain my reasons. I figured if they didn't understand by now, they never would. I hit send. Then I turned off my phone and left it off for the rest of the day. Later that evening, I got a knock on the door. For a brief second, my heart jumped, thinking maybe they had tracked me down, maybe Kyle had shown up, red-faced and wild-eyed, ready to unleash whatever immature tantrum he had brewing. But it was just the Airbnb host dropping off extra towels. I thanked her, made small talk, and realized with some surprise that I hadn't had a normal, uncharged conversation in months. That night, as I lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling fan turning lazily overhead, I thought about revenge. Not the petty, vindictive kind, but the quiet, strategic kind. The kind that doesn't need shouting or spectacle to make its point. I wasn't trying to hurt them. I was just finally stopping the hurt they had normalized for so long. The next morning, I checked my email. There were no replies from my family, no apologies, no acknowledgments. But there was one from Natalie, the agent. She'd already drafted the listing agreement. All I had to do was sign. And somewhere back in that cold, silent house, Kyle was probably still pacing, still cursing, still waiting for someone else to fix the mess. For the first time in his life, he was going to have to figure out what to do without me. And I was going to enjoy every second of watching him do it, from a safe, silent distance. There's a very specific kind of silence that follows betrayal, one that doesn't crash down on you all at once like a wave, but instead seeps in slowly through the cracks, wrapping itself around your thoughts until the noise in your heads begins to mimic it. And suddenly, everything you once questioned becomes blindingly clear. That's the silence I woke up to a week after sending the email, the one where I officially told my family I was selling the house. No calls, no texts, not even one of Kyle's dramatic voice messages accusing me of ruining everything. And that silence, I realized, wasn't just their shock. It was the weight of a reality they never imagined would touch them, finally pressing down. Natalie, my realtor, worked faster than I expected. Or maybe I just hadn't realized how quickly things moved when the decision wasn't being filtered through the fog of guilt and second-guessing that I used to carry like a second skin. She came by, had a photographer take some wide-angle shots of the living room I once painted myself, uploaded crisp images of the kitchen I renovated with my bonus 2 years ago, and sent me the final listing by Friday. I didn't even have to go inside. The locksmith had already changed the locks per my request, and I had arranged a separate showing schedule that didn't require anyone to be home, assuming they were even still living there, which, judging by the voicemail I eventually received, they most definitely were. I had almost forgotten what day it was. when I heard the ding from my phone and saw the new message pop up with that familiar area code. It was from Mom. I hesitated, not because I didn't want to hear it, but because I already knew what kind of voice would be waiting on the other end. I knew it wouldn't be calm or composed, and it definitely wouldn't be apologetic. But curiosity still got the better of me, and I hit play, holding the phone a little away from my ear, like that might somehow soften the blow of whatever hurricane she'd decided to unleash. Her voice cracked immediately, not with sadness, but with fury barely contained by confusion. "Jessica, what the hell is going on? A real estate agent just showed up at the door, and we had no idea. The locks are changed. Your father had to let them in through the garage because the key doesn't work anymore. Are you out of your mind? You didn't even give us a chance to talk. What is this? Some kind of punishment? You think this is fair?" She paused there, and for a split second, I thought I heard the sound of her catching her breath, maybe even wiping her face, before she continued in that sharp, clipped tone she always used when she felt cornered but still wanted to sound like she was in control. "You're making a mistake, Jess. This house isn't just some building. This is your family's home. We raised you here, and this stunt, this is heartless. If you think this makes you strong, think again. You're going to regret this." I didn't reply. I didn't even flinch, because for the first time in years, I knew I wasn't the one making the mistake. The house had been mine legally for nearly a decade, but emotionally, I'd never truly owned it. I'd merely been a tenant of convenience, funding someone else's comfort while mine was always seen as secondary. My room upstairs had always been called Jess's little space, like I was borrowing it, like I was just visiting despite paying for the roof that sat above all of our heads. I cooked the meals, repaired the plumbing, paid for every light bulb and HVAC filter, and yet somehow I was still treated like an overgrown child who hadn't figured out how to make it on her own. They didn't see me as a provider, they saw me as a placeholder, a safety net they could lean on until someone or something else came along. But nothing ever did, because I never gave them a reason to change, until now. Natalie called an hour later. "We already have 2 offers, both above asking," she said, her voice calm, but clearly impressed by the level of interest. "The market's hot right now. You're going to walk away with a nice check." I thanked her, felt my chest tighten for just a second, and then let the relief wash over me. Because I knew, even as the guilt tried one last time to get a foothold, that this wasn't just about the money. It was about closing a chapter that had held me hostage for far too long. I didn't tell them about the offer. I didn't tell them about the 30-day eviction notice that was now taped to the inside of the front door. I figured if they were going to treat me like a landlord when it suited them, and a dependent when it didn't, they could deal with the legal side of things like adults for once. The notice was courteous, standard, and above all, fair. They'd had years to stand on their own. They just never tried. A few days later, I drove by the house, not to go in, not even to speak to them, but just to see it one last time from a distance. The lawn was starting to brown. The mailbox hung slightly crooked, and the blinds in the front window were bent in a way I hadn't noticed before. It didn't look like a home anymore. It looked like a memory I didn't need to carry around. I drove back to the Airbnb, signed the paperwork Natalie had sent, and officially accepted the offer. The closing date was set for 3 weeks out. The check would be deposited directly into my account. And just like that, the house was no longer theirs. It was never really theirs to begin with. But now they couldn't pretend otherwise. There was no explosion, no big confrontation, just a voicemail, a legal notice, and the sound of a front door closing behind them. Sometimes the most satisfying revenge doesn't look like revenge at all. It just looks like walking away while they finally, painfully, have to figure it all out without you. It's strange, in the quiet, deliberate kind of way that sneaks up on you while you're doing something mundane, like folding laundry or waiting for a red light to change. How grief and peace can occupy the same space at the same time. How you can feel both liberated and heartbroken. While sipping coffee in a silent room you finally call your own. Almost a year had passed since that unforgettable Thanksgiving dinner, the one where my mother looked me straight in the eye across a table I had set, beneath a roof I paid for, and told me with absolute confidence that it was time I left. And now, with Thanksgiving creeping back onto the calendar, its date circled in red ink on countless planners across America, I found myself neither dreading nor anticipating it. I simply noted its approach like the weather, inevitable, indifferent, and no longer something I had to prepare for. The house sold cleanly, without drama or delay, which, given the history of everything else that had unfolded inside those walls, felt almost like a cosmic joke. Natalie kept me updated with cheerful efficiency, her emails detailing each step of the closing process in neat bullet points, each one drawing a sharper and sharper line between the life I'd lived and the one I was now creating from scratch. The check cleared without issue. The title changed hands. The new owners, a retired couple from Michigan who wanted to be closer to their grandkids, moved in without ever knowing the history embedded in the floorboards and family photos that had been cleared out with more resentment than nostalgia. And my family, well, I'd love to say they landed on their feet, found their own way, pulled together like the Brady Bunch in a third-act montage of redemption and togetherness. But real life doesn't come with soundtracks or scripted reconciliations. I didn't hear from Kyle at all after the sale. Not when the eviction notice arrived. Not when the locks were changed. Not even when the real estate listing went viral in our sleepy little corner of Ohio, with neighbors gossiping over whose name was actually on the deed. He vanished into whatever couch he found next, and I imagine he still spends his days online, raging against systems he doesn't understand, blaming others for the consequences of his own inertia. Dad tried once. A letter, handwritten, folded neatly in an envelope with no return address, showed up at my Airbnb 2 weeks after the sale closed. His words were soft, unsure, a mixture of apology and confusion, like he couldn't quite grasp what had happened or why it felt so final. He didn't ask me to come back. He didn't defend my mother. He just wrote, "I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry I didn't." And even though it wasn't enough, it was something. I didn't respond, not because I was angry, but because I didn't know what version of me he was writing to, the daughter who used to pay the bills or the woman who finally walked away. And Mom? She never called again. Not after the voicemail, not after the papers were signed, not even when I knew, through the same grapevine of nosy neighbors and former family friends, that they had moved into a 2-bedroom apartment just outside of town, one that wasn't nearly as comfortable or as cheap as living rent-free under the illusion that they were helping me. Maybe she saw my silence as betrayal. Maybe she believed her own story, the one where I was the ungrateful child who turned her back on her loving family. Or maybe, deep down, she knew she'd pushed one time too many and watched the last bridge burn in a fire she started herself. Now, with the holiday looming once more, I found myself in a quiet little cabin nestled in the hills of upstate New York, surrounded by trees that were just beginning to shed their final leaves, a wood-burning stove casting soft orange light across the walls, and a fridge stocked with exactly what I wanted. No dry turkey, no soggy stuffing, no half-frozen pumpkin pie that someone forgot to take out in time. Just me, a bottle of wine, a playlist I made for myself, and a dinner that didn't need to impress anyone. There were no screaming matches over who ruined the gravy, no guilt-tripping glances from across the table, no unspoken tension wrapped up in "pass the rolls." There was just the sound of the wind against the window panes, the smell of roasted vegetables and garlic, and the deep, aching peace that only comes from choosing yourself after years of forgetting you had the right to do so. I'd made a reservation for one, not because I was alone, but because I was finally with someone who mattered, me. And somewhere out there, in some small, beige-walled apartment with mismatched furniture and a TV that probably only works when the Wi-Fi isn't spotty, I imagine they're having their own Thanksgiving. I imagine Mom says grace a little louder than usual, her voice tight, her smile too wide. I imagine Dad pokes at his food without eating much. I imagine Kyle complains about the mashed potatoes. And I imagine, just for a second, that there's a moment where someone says my name, and it hangs in the air like a ghost. But they won't call, not because they don't want to, but because they don't know how to cross the distance they created, and I simply stopped shrinking to accommodate. And me, I won't answer, because the line between forgiveness and forgetting is thin, and I've spent too long confusing one for the other. As the sun dipped below the trees and the wind picked up just enough to make the cabin creak in that familiar, cozy way, I raised a glass, not to revenge, not to triumph, not even to freedom, but to the quiet, hard-won knowledge that sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't fight, it's leave.